These critics, I have to ask, are they looking for truth or are they looking for loopholes around the truth? It seems to me, here's what they're willing to do, including Bart Ehrman. They're willing to exclude or leave out all of the explanatory passages. They cherry pick the verses that make them sound like they're contradictions and leave out the didactic verses that explain why the differences. Does the Bible ever say that there was only one woman at the tomb and that was Mary Magdalene? Well, no. It just says Mary Magdalene went. The evidence of details only eyewitnesses could know are excluded from the argument as far as Bart Ehrman is concerned. I mean that if you read the New Testament, the Gospels and Acts in particular, there are so many historical details, geographical details, custom details, the titles and the names of so many historical people in the Bible. Those are totally excluded from the argument. Why? Hey, welcome to Church for Skeptics. Dan Arsenal here. We've been talking about Bart Ehrman on Easter in the last few videos, and this one will kind of be a concluding episode of that idea. I'm going to use his phrase, it depends on which gospel you read. Let me review a little bit. I don't want to rehash everything. You can go watch the videos if you have an interest for that. But here's his point regarding Easter and its historicity. That's the big idea. Is it possible that Jesus was raised from the dead in history? Is that historically even possible? So his reasoning against that, of course, and there's a consistency in his reasoning for that. The same three issues come up, three or four, depending on how you delineate them. The same issues come up every time in his debates and his books, and of course, I would do the same thing. Number one, and this we address this in part one of this series here, the Bible can't be true historically, on his view, because it was written too long after the events that it portrays. So, you know, if the New Testament in particular, the Gospels in particular, were written 60s to 90s, maybe the apostles weren't even living then, and so he thinks they were written by Greek Christians that just collected stories and wrote them down. And, you know, my response to that in general is hogwash, and I think we can show that conclusively. The second idea that comes along with that is if they were late, they were anonymous. Whoever wrote those didn't sign their name. Nobody in the ancient world did that. They might have a title page, and by the way, we get the title pages. As soon as we get them, we get the authors. So his second point is that the New Testament was anonymous. Therefore, it's not historical. He's just manipulating the facts. And I don't want to, we go back and watch it again if you want to, but the details simply come out to this. As soon as we get first page manuscripts, which is late 2nd century, anything written in the ancient world, we don't have any autographs of that. So as soon as we get manuscripts that have the first page, the first pages or title pages have the authors. And they're all Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, no matter where they come from. There are no anonymous gospels. They don't exist. They're manufactured in the minds of critics. The other idea he has is since the New Testament is not historical, and if the New Testament is not historical, certainly the resurrection's not. Because the stories that these Greek so-called authors were writing, they collected stories, and the stories just, evolved over several years, 60, 70 years. And so they're, in his words, they are contradictory. They are irrevocably contradictory. There's so many contradictions, and that was his testimony. We'll talk about that maybe in the next video a little bit. But he was a textual critic. He's kind of branched out now to be a historian and a philosopher as well, I guess. He had trouble with reconciling some of the differences in the New Testament. There certainly are many differences. You might even call them discrepancies. You would not, however, call them contradictions. So that's the third layer of his argument. They are late, they are anonymous, and they are contradictory, especially when it comes to the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. That's when he wants, it depends, he asks a question. And we talked about that last time. Did the women come? How many women came to the tomb? It depends on which gospel you read. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll give you a couple of the preview contradictions here, and we're not going to spend time on them. First one was, of course, how many women came to the tomb? It depends on which gospel you read. And I want to say this. It does depend on which gospel you read, because each gospel writer interviewed those people. None of the gospel writers were actually there at the empty tomb when the women came. So they're interviewing, talking to the women, the testimony of the women, which of course came immediately. John would have remembered all those things because he was in a different situation. He wouldn't be interviewing later those women, other than maybe his stepmother, you might call her, Mary, as long as she lived. We don't know how long that was. How many women came to the tomb on Easter morning? Was it just Mary? Was it the two Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James? Did Salome hang out with them, or was it Salome and the two Marys and Joanna? And when you get to Luke, it says, and the other women. So there's an entourage of them. The ones that the New Testament writers select for their documents don't have anything to do with, they're not contradictory at all. They're complementary. They're supplementary, you might say. That was the first issue here, and it's frivolous. The second one that he wants to harp about are how many angels, were they men or were they angels at first? And how many angels were there? Well, it depends on which gospel you read. And of course, this is not hard to reconcile, to understand that in Scripture, throughout the Bible, angels are described as men. They look like men. They act like men. Pretty powerful men. In one particular gospel, I think it's in the Gospel of Luke, it starts out talking about these two men, and then later when the women say there are two men there, but then when they come back and to report that to the disciples, they say two angels. They knew there were angels that looked like men. That's not a contradiction. It's not even a discrepancy. How can he look if he wants to make those into discrepancies, into contradictions? Okay, and if you want to swallow that, okay. And if you want to disbelieve that Jesus died for your sins and rose again for our justification, Romans says, if you want to believe that, you can, but you're not doing it based on the reasoning, based on the facts, based on the logic. Let's continue. The third one, we're making progress here. Was the stone rolled away? Ehrman thinks the stone was rolled away. So his question is, was the stone rolled away before the women got there, or after the women got there, or during the time that they were there? It depends on which gospel you read. I'm not going to read all the scriptures. I'm going to read you one passage here from Matthew. 3 of the 4 gospels make it crystal clear that the stone had been rolled away before the women got there. It may be that as they started their journey, we don't know how long that was. Was it a quarter mile? Was it a half a mile? Was it a mile? Was it more? How long did it take them to start in dark and get there at the first light or right after sunrise? We don't know those details. Certainly they're not contradictory. But the point is, in those 3 gospels, which would be Mark, Luke, and John, it's crystal clear that the stone had been rolled away before the women got there. Now you get to Matthew, and here's the issue. I'll read Matthew chapter 28, the first couple of verses. After the Sabbath, Matthew 28:1, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Then, it says, the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." I can understand where you might think, if you just read this and none of the other Gospels, you might think, oh, I guess they got there and then Jesus was still in the tomb. And then the angel came and shook the earthquake and rolled the stone away, and the guards fainted, and they saw all that. But that's not what it says. It just simply says, and by the way, if you do this in the Greek, if you read, I'm reading NIV, if you read the New American Standard, which is supposed to be the closest to the Greek wording, it would say there had been a violent earthquake and the angel came down and rolled the stone away and the guards knocked out. It doesn't say what critics think it's saying. It doesn't contradict the other Gospels. It supplements them. It complements them. Yes, the stone was already rolled away. Here's why. An angel came, there was an earthquake, and the angel rolled the stone away. By the way, not so Jesus could get out. He could walk the wall of his resurrected body. It was so that they could look in and see that the tomb was empty. And that everything took off, of course, from there. My question would be this. If the angels came and the earthquake took place and the guards were knocked out, did the women come and see all that and have to walk over the guards, the knocked out guards, to get to look in the tomb? Well, let me read you a little bit more in Matthew then. Matthew chapter 28, verse 11. While the women were on their way back to report the empty tomb to the disciples. So they went, they saw, they're going back, and this is Matthew's recollection of this. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city. So apparently they revived. Did they revive before the women got there or after? We're not told that one way or the other. I'm going to say before they were revived. But nonetheless, they were left. When the women left, apparently that same time frame, the guards were going to and here they didn't go back to their Roman guards. They didn't go back to their commanding officers. They went to the Jewish high priests because they knew they'd get protection from them. And then it says they went to the high priest and reported everything that happened so that they knew what happened. The guards told them, look, the miraculous thing happened here. And then when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. And of course, that doesn't fly. Nobody really believes that even. Even historians that aren't believers don't believe that actually happened. It's the story that Jewish scholars in the ancient world kept saying that the disciples had stolen the body even up into the 2nd century. The point is, there's no contradiction here. I'm going to give you one more and then do some conclusion. This is one of my favorite things here, and I'll tell you why it is in a bit. What time of day was Jesus crucified? Depends on which gospel you read, according to Bart Ehrman. All of the synoptic gospels say that Jesus was crucified the 3rd hour. Now, all of us understand that means 9 o'clock. So you have the first 3 hours, 9 o'clock until noon. At noon, there were 3 hours of darkness, so you have from noon to 3 o'clock. And then at the 9th hour, which would have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus died right after the lights came back on. We may do a video on that, on what about the darkness. On the other hand, John's always throwing a cog in the woodworks here. John says that when Jesus was at Pilate's house, his palace, on his trial, they say it was the 6th hour. Well, wait a minute. If the 6th hour, that would have been noon, according to the synoptics. That means Jesus couldn't have been crucified till way later than that, so there must be a contradiction, right? Well, here's what I did. I went to Google, good old neutral Google, and I said, is there any difference between Jewish time and Roman time? Remember, John's writing years later. He is the last gospel, and he's talking about Roman trials here with Pilate, and according to Roman time, it would have been in the 6th hour, not the 3rd hour. Yep, sure enough. Google says that on Jewish time, and this is even more than that, in Jewish time in Judea, the southern part. In Galilee, the Jewish time was different. In Galilee, time started at the evening before. And so that's when you have all this preparation stuff, and that's why that Jesus had to be taken down on the cross on Friday before nightfall, because that began the Passover. This is in Jewish thinking, and that's why historians think that there really was a tomb of Jesus. That was the way it was done. In Roman time, however, in the 1st century, Romans had the same time frame as us. It started at 12 a.m. midnight. Just like we say 12 a.m., 1 a.m. it's the next day, or it's that day. But the 6th hour would be what? 6 o'clock, the same as the synoptics in Jewish time. Now, all I had to do was Google that and think there's no discrepancy here. There's not even a discrepancy. As a matter of fact, John confirms exactly what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are saying. So I want to draw some conclusions here. Number one, differences, and even I'll go far as say discrepancies, establish historicity. They don't detract from it. Historians know that when you have eyewitness testimony and you have independent sources like that there are going to be differences in the secondary details. And that's what all of these are. How many women? What time? When did the stone get rolled away? What time was it? These are all secondary details. The historical facts are all the same. Jesus died and was buried, and his tomb was found empty, and the disciples believed. Those are historical facts. That's the big picture. The secondary details do not affect the historicity, even when we do resolve them. So the second thing is these critics, I have to ask, are they looking for truth, or are they looking for loopholes around the truth? It just seems like that to me. Maybe you'd think differently. I understand that. They're willing, it seems to me, here's what they're willing to do, including Bart Ehrman. They're willing to exclude or leave out all of the explanatory passages. They cherry pick the verses that make them sound like they're contradictions and leave out the didactic verses that explain why the difference is. Why not? Why don't they do that? Why don't they just use the whole Bible? If they're going to use part of it, use all of it. And then the second thing they do is to read into those verses things that aren't really there. Does the Bible ever say that there was only one woman at the tomb and that was Mary Magdalene? Well, no. It just says Mary Magdalene went. Does the Bible say that the women were there when the tomb was rolled away or the stone was rolled away? No, it doesn't say that, but they read that into it. They intuit that or infer that to make their point. The third thing I want to say is this. The evidence of details only eyewitnesses could know are excluded from the argument as far as Bart Ehrman is concerned. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you read the New Testament, the Gospels and Acts in particular, there are so many historical details, geographical details, custom details, the titles and the names of so many historical people in the Bible, that if you were writing 70 years later or so, and you weren't ever there, you would not, if you had never been to those places, you would not know most of those geographical, those minute details that only an eyewitness would know. And there's tons of information about this out there. Those are totally excluded from the argument. Why? To me, that makes it even all the more historical, all the more eyewitness testimony, which is exactly what the Bible claims that it is. And we've, of course, we've hashed that a lot. The primary facts are what make history. And the primary facts are the life, death, the burial, and the empty tomb, the women, and the faith of the disciples. That's the big picture, and that's what you can believe. Thanks for watching.